too much, but what I thought I'd do today is give you about 10 minutes of discussion about the pending cybersecurity legislation. It's already passed the House, and it may or may not be considered in the Senate before the August recess. If you want my prediction, which is worth about what you pay for it, I'm going to guess that Senator Reid is going to bring up the Democrat alternative, the Lieberman-Collins bill, and probably fill the tree so that there are no amendments possible, and then seek cloture, which he won't get, and then that'll be the end of it, and the parties will fight politically over who to blame for the failure to pass any cybersecurity legislation. The reason I make this prediction is because there's a fundamental disagreement out there, and the fundamental disagreement is about whether or not we need a regulatory regime for cybersecurity. That is a government-sponsored system of defining cybersecurity standards for industry across America or for critical industry across America. I'd submit to you that the right answer, the answer that is basically embodied in the McCain alternative, is that regulatory structures like that are unnecessary and, in fact, would be affirmatively harmful. To think about that, I want to posit for you that there are actually three different kind of buckets of cybersecurity harm that we should be thinking about. Right? The first of those is cybercrime. And there's lots of it. I mean, let's be clear. There's crime in cyberspace is rampant. It's as rampant as crime in the real world. Estimates range from $300 billion to $1 trillion annually globally. That's a lot of money. But in a world economy that's $100 trillion in GDP, it's not an existential threat. More importantly, if you think that crime is the problem, then the answer is pretty much traditional answers to criminal problems. More increased criminal penalties, more deterrence, more resources for the police. In this context, probably some greater information sharing and international cooperation across boundaries because lots of the criminals are overseas. But it isn't regulation. In the crime context, regulating cybersecurity standards is a lot like passing a set of rules that says that everybody needs to put bars on their house or better locks on their door because we, as the government, can't control the criminality outside. So we're going to make you responsible and liable if you don't protect yourself. That seems to me the wrong answer. The second bucket, which is a national security bucket, is espionage. And again, cyber espionage is rampant. Though the Chinese deny it, their denials are but a bare fig leaf at this point, that they are engaged in an extensive program of espionage, not just national security espionage, industrial espionage as well, but particularly directed at the defense industrial base. Lockheed Martin's been targeted. Almost every major defense contractor has at one time or another been targeted, some successfully, some not. The biggest problem, of course, is that there must be some attacks that succeeded that we don't know the nature of the success. But there again, if espionage is the question and the problem, then we are actually proceeding pretty well in the right direction, which is extending the protective umbrella of U.S. government protection, working with NSA to the extent possible, out to the defense industrial base. The Department of Defense had a program that was called the Defense Industrial Base Pilot. It's just gone permanent. It worked pretty well. It didn't have a huge effect, probably stopped about 10% more attacks than the private sector could do on its own, but a 10% plus up in efficiency is a good thing. We shouldn't sneer at that. It's only if you actually think that a war is imminent and that you're going to see a massive attack on America's critical infrastructure in the near term that you might think about regulating cyberspace, that you might think about imposing requirements on actors outside of the defense industrial base, people like the electric grid or the financial markets or things like that. I'm not in the intel community, so I can't tell you how likely it is that there'll be such an attack. What I can tell you is that right now the capability for that sort of attack is very limited. It isn't rampant in cyberspace. Anonymous couldn't do it. The small hacker groups, the terrorist groups, they don't have that capacity yet. They may in 10 years, but they don't yet. Today, if such an attack were to happen, it would be China or possibly Russia or a couple of other major peer nation-state actors like that. So the likelihood of that sort of scenario is about the same as what you think of it might be the likelihood of a real-world confrontation with China, say over Taiwan. But even if you thought that that were the likelihood, even if you thought that that little bucket over there was a realistic possibility, the question is government regulation the answer? It was great. Just yesterday, Susan Collins gave a talk in which she said that we needed, this is in support of the Lieberman-Collins bill, regulation that is nimble, imaginative, effective, and efficient. And then she said we should give the job to the Department of Homeland Security. I mean, I almost don't have to start. I almost don't have to say anything more. Right? The idea that the federal government, even outside of the Department of Homeland Security, let's leave them aside, but that the idea that the federal government's regulatory systems can keep up with the pace of change of the threat in cyberspace, such that our cybersecurity standards that we set are meeting the current threats, is laughable. The average major regulation in the United States takes 24 to 36 months to go through if it's a major regulation with a large cost. The Moore's Law says that the pace of processing capacity doubles every 18 months, 18 to 24 months. So basically, if you put that together, the rules we would write would be effective for 2 generations ago of cybersecurity threat. It simply is the case that the federal government rules and regulation policy sedan cannot keep up with the Porsche of innovation in cyberspace. Even worse, even if you thought that we could keep up, the straitjacket of regulation would basically stifle innovation, right? When you get a rigid set of standards that don't change quickly enough or that impose a certain viewpoint on how to do things, you stifle the changes in the innovation that come in the next generation. The best example of this is that much of the drafting of the current bill is based upon what we call intrusion detection and prevention. If you look at the Lieberman-Collins bill, it's basically the Maginot Line theory of cybersecurity, which is that we're going to stop all of the threats before they happen. Anybody who's in the business these days knows that that's nonsensical. You're shaking your head. Advanced persistent threats beat the firewalls every time. The right answer is more of a resiliency model where you expect some attacks to succeed. You do hunting inside your own networks to root them out, and you build backups and analog systems so that you can fix your systems once they're attacked. So even the bill that we've written is focused on last generation set of threats. That's the Lieberman-Collins bill. The McCain bill takes a much simpler approach. It says, let's do the simple thing. Let's take the successful defense industrial-based pilot and basically generalize it so that we're sharing information around all of the affected critical infrastructure industries. To my mind, a bad bill would be worse than no bill at all. A bill with regulation in it would be the worst sort of bill. So I'm actually not so unhappy with the idea that nothing may actually happen this time around. And then maybe we can get it right in the next Congress and in the next Senate. And with that, I'll stop and take questions. Sir.
All right, let's start with Dan.
You get to call.
I'll give you a heads up about what it's going to be if I can, very quickly. But what is potential President Romney's position on this?
The question is, what is potential President Romney's position on this? And the answer is, I don't think that I know of that he's articulated one in enough detail for me to give you any answer. There may be, but it is certainly, I don't think that this is a front burner campaign issue.
Down, Christine.
Given that you don't particularly like either of those bills, if you were to write the bill yourself, what do you think should be done?
Well, I don't want to leave the impression that I don't particularly. I think that the McCain generalizing of information sharing, good idea. You know, if implemented correctly, it could be a real helper. It has some privacy and civil liberties pushback from the other side because information sharing links to people's fears of Big Brother. I don't think that they're that significant. I think they can be addressed. I certainly would not be upset if the McCain bill came along. What I would do, if it were me, for one thing, I would invest more money in education, cyber education, starting younger, right? I mean, that's a long-term thing. We don't have a lot of cyber Jedis in the world. I would incentivize if the government's going to have any role at all, I would incentivize resilience things. I mean, fundamentally, the problem with resilience is the same as the problem with hospital beds, right? In the medical world, the ideal number of empty hospital beds in a hospital is about 3%, right? If you have more than that, you're losing money. On the other hand, if there's an epidemic and you only have 3% empty beds, you're overwhelmed. Resilience in the cyber world is the same. You want to have just enough servers to be doing what you want and a little bit for extra surge capacity. But if you need to move to a backup system, the backup system's job is to sit there and never be used, so it's all cost. So we can think of ways to incentivize that, maybe even collectivize it. I hate to say that, but South Korea has built what they call a cyber redoubt for small businesses to go to in time of attack, where they've built the walls and they've got the extra servers, and it's a government thing that you can glom onto. A worthy idea.
Michelle.
Paul, last week I heard General Alexander, who's the director of NSA, talk about information sharing in a very different way. He said that he made the observation that the threats manifest themselves at network speed, and that there is value, from his perspective, in having some way for the U.S. government, appropriate elements of the U.S. government, to be alerted when a critical infrastructure network may be under attack, when anomalies are observed or whatever it might be, in order to take measures. From what you know of the critical infrastructure networks, does that appeal to you? And if so, is that a legislative possibility to enable that to happen?
That's the hardest nut of the question, right? What does NSA do if Baltimore Gas and Electric is whacked and they lose all of their power? My first answer is I hope that General Alexander has a lot of backup generators, that he invests in the resiliency. But leaving that aside, my fundamental view is twofold. First, there's an appropriate role for the government at the highest levels, provide for the common defense kind of idea. Second, since it's an 85 to 90% civilian network, I'd prefer to see the first responder be the civilian agencies like DHS. That's inconsistent with what I just said because, of course, right now everybody in this room knows that DHS doesn't have the horses to do that. But the optimal policy is to get the civilian agencies to a position where we do not have to militarize a civilian domain in a way that raises hackles for everybody. Even the most conservative like me, I'm not sure I want General Alexander, nothing about him, right? But I'm not sure I want a militarized response to all the threats in cyberspace. I'd much prefer a good civilian one.
Gentleman right here. You identify yourself.
Mike Stransky, Policy Committee. Do you have any insight into the efforts by Senators Kyle and Whitehouse to try to thread the needle between the two competing versions?
I have as much insight as you. I've seen their outline and I've read the public reports. They certainly aren't consulting me. I don't think that the needle is threadable. From what I've seen in the public reports, they're not offering enough in terms of liability protection and incentives to make it worth any private sector actors' efforts to do. And I am very much concerned that in the end, the voluntary standards that they're sort of leaning towards wind up becoming de facto mandatory standards. If not through direct government regulation, then through some form of liability regime that's tied to the inadequate liability protections. And if that's the case, then my concerns are the same, right? Whenever we set standards in this dynamic environment, I just don't think that works, because if they're set in a fixed enough way to make them actionable, they become too set in stone to make them usable.
Christine.
One other question in dealing with SCADA and local state regulatory environments, particularly for the grid, for water infrastructure and elsewhere. One of the problems that we encountered is that, for instance, local electrical companies both deal with state-level regulations that are all over the map, but they also have liability issues. If they admit that there's a problem, if they try to take steps to, there's insurance coverage issues, and there's also SEC stockholder disclosure issues. So that's a lot of complex problems for an individual business to take on their own, or for that matter, for Congress to try and deal with. But it is the current litigious legal and regulatory environment. How do we solve that?
Actually, I'm glad you asked that, because that should have been a piece to my answer to your first question, right? And I forgot it in the rush of events, which is there is room for a model code, if you will, of liability protection, of uniform, that is not a mandate, but kind of the thing that if we had, like the UCC, the Uniform Commercial Code, right? You know, if you adopt commercially reasonable practices, you avoid this kind of liability. There's room for that would be adoptable, not maybe by congressional fiat from the top, but I'd prefer it from the state levels. But there's certainly room for that sort of approach, because right now, if you are a large-scale utility provider who spans 5 states, you've got at least 6 regulators who are on your head, and you've got 6 liability regimes, and your basic answer is to hunker down and say, "Please don't hit me," which works pretty well.